I want to come back to kind of some of the points that Brian was raising about how we value and judge the kind of applied policy work within the university context, which often seems to be driven by a science model of measurement. So you were talking about promotion, you were talking about kind of institutional traction in terms of how the research is perceived within universities. It seems to be that's a fundamental problem. I mean, on the one side, there's how policymakers view what we do, but then there's how our own institutions and state agencies, such as the HEA, view what we want to do. And it seems as if the question remains as to how should the policy research should be judged and should be rewarded. And we really need to think that through to a certain degree. I mean, certainly within the context of the institute that I would run, where we have 20-odd research staff all doing applied social science research, the measure of our success is we get continuation funding from agencies coming back to us time and again, and they obviously wouldn't do that unless they felt that the work was of use to them at some level. And the pressure is to produce the great literature for them in this kind of timely fashion. But because everybody is on soft money contracts, you're constantly moving on to the next project and not necessarily with the time and the horizon to write up into the international journal articles. So you get people who are kind of caught in this bind how they're measured in terms of their productivity in relation to the university through a science model, and then their actual work practices in terms of what they're funded to do are out of sync. So, I mean, we can talk about how policymakers view us, but even within our own institutions, how they view the kind of work that we do, there's a question as to how we work towards addressing that and changing our own institutional cultures as to how they value our work.
Let's, not just to Brian, but to all anyone on the proprietary want to do that. This year, after moving from the Research Institute to university, was the context that we brought it up partially, please.
Yeah, I guess there's a way we shouldn't do it, and that is reward what now tends to get referred to as grey literature in and of itself, in that I think to progress in a university setting, it seems entirely reasonable that a core standard should be that you're publishing good journal-focused output in my field. Other fields won't necessarily be as hung up on journals as economics. But it seems to me that we have to find a way where we can facilitate both individuals and teams of people in doing both, in doing the journal articles that are going to be the primary output from the point of view of the university and rewarded as such, but in integrating that with well-focused, institutionally informed applied policy work. Now, I don't think that's addressed by changing the reward structure for individuals so much as by trying to collaborate with funders to build research teams that are funded for a decent period rather than on a continual cycle of soft money lasting maybe 6 months. I think it simply isn't possible to do it that way. It ultimately goes back to the funding structure, and we have to argue for a funding structure where, for example, if you look at the 10-year research centres that the ESRC has funded in the UK down the years, they have certainly produced very high quality output in journal article form, but they've also been some of them have been very effective and influential in producing policy-focused research, because they've got a core of medium to long-term funding where a mix of outputs is expected. So I don't think, I think it ultimately goes back to the funding and to persuading our institutions and funders jointly that that is what is going to deliver for both.
Any other member of the panel?
Well, just to add what Brian is saying, I completely agree with you, Rob. I think part of the problem is that in a lot of research centres you're living off soft money. So not only going from hand to mouth in terms of project to project sometimes, it's even worse than that, because you don't have time to get into the, to get journal papers into the journals. What you can have is, when you do that, other people who are not doing research at all, but are working in universities, then come out with publications where they criticise research that has been done. It's even worse than that. I think part of it is, I'd agree with Brian, part of it is about making sure that there's capacity to do research projects that you want to do, that's not just evaluation work, or that's not just under pressure in terms of days and times, in terms from commissioners, but that allows you time, affords you time to develop research, both in terms of dissemination, but in terms of policy, policy and journals.
Well, just wanted to say something about what we're going through in the UK, which I think is going to change the landscape of research assessment, and which then is linked directly to issues such as promotion, ranking, and all of that in the next 5-10 years, because of the introduction of what is called impact of research. So for the first time, the research assessment exercise is not going to just be based on the quality of your academic outputs, which has always been the case, and I think it's been the biggest enemy of engagement, because we all went away and tried to improve the academic, our academic outputs, which is usually peer-reviewed journal articles and so on. And this is now going to be changed, because up to a quarter of the assessment of the quality of research in different institutions is going to be based on their non-academic impact. Now, if you ask me how they're going to measure it, we will be here for another 2 hours, but it will definitely, as I said, will change the whole structure of what do we see as research quality, and then will definitely lead into different systems of promotion and understanding of excellence.
Well, other than to say, I suppose, that in the context of cross-border cooperation, an awful lot of the research projects that were funded, we couldn't respond to them in the university because they were short-term, they were 6-month jobs and so on. And we're university not geared to do that, right? So we had to look for longer-term funding. On the question of impact, I think that's an interesting one. I mean, in principle, I think that on the grounds of accountability, there's a strong argument for the engagement of academics with policy people in the widest sense of the term. But the problem is, of course, is the measurement of it and how it's going to be assessed. But it's this kind of, I think what academics can do, they can do some joined-up thinking. They're in a space where they can do some joined-up thinking that policymakers cannot do or people on the ground cannot do. And they can reflect on things, they can compare them, they can link things up. And I think that's certainly one big function of academics in the policy field.
Thanks. Yeah. So over here and then over here again. Okay. Well, we'll see there. There's 4 people or 5. We'll have no problem. We'll get to everybody. Yeah.
Thanks. Benefiting from sitting in the workplace.
Yeah.
Celia Keenan from the Child and Family Research Centre in HSE. I'm just wondering about the kind of challenge to researchers ourselves to impact some change in terms of our methodologies and our processes. Because if we're talking about empowering research, and there's a lot of shift, particularly in terms of children's research, of how the process itself impacts on the children or whoever we're doing research with. There's also possibilities there, I think, in terms of maybe moving towards that evidence-informed society, that we have as much of a challenge there. And that through the process of the actual research that we're carrying out and the communications that are back and forward anyway with the policymakers or whoever it is, that I think there's some responsibility on us to try and achieve change through the process, not just through the output. And often I think it's more the process than the results that can achieve the most of it.
anyone in the panel that wants to comment on that?
Well, just to say, I mean, I think you're very aware of this, but I mean, one of the biggest challenges is about how, from the point of view of children's services, how you actually engage with both service providers and people who dictate policy in children's research. And one of the biggest mistakes I think that we've made in the past has been that research has been overly focused on seeing kind of researchers as coming in and getting out, coming in, doing a piece of research and getting out and going away again. It's kind of almost like a kind of grab it and run away kind of approach. And researchers go off with the data and then try and turn it into a journal paper. And people who commission research are saying, well, what was all that about anyway? And usually, you know, and sometimes the time levels are even very tight and not enough money as well. One of the things that crossed my mind, actually, as Brian was speaking, is that there probably is a need to create new kind of relationships that is not a commissioner, purchaser, provider relationship. Because, you know, from talking to a lot of the philanthropic community, one of the criticisms they make of universities are they're too slow at the research, they're not in touch with what's going on. These are the things they're saying. And that what inevitably happens is they go off and set up their own research unit, you know, almost not in competition to the university, but as kind of an alternative route. What would seem to me is that a logical way forward, which gets away from the soft money approach, is to try and create some new kind of relationship between people who commission children's research, people who deliver it, and provide it in a different way, which is what, you know, in some ways we're trying to do. But I think that's it. And then you can get into the question of methodologies, both qualitative and quantitative, longitudinal research, which is very hard to get agreement on, and so particularly at the moment. You know.
I think one thing we should give a lot more attention to is empowering the people we study, certainly as sociologists, and giving them a voice, whether it's children or teenagers or community developers or whatever, and create kind of forum which you can feed back and they, you know, there's interaction subsequent to the research, rather than going away and simply writing an article for a good journal.
Okay. That's the way I do it. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if the next turn.
Oh, no, it's okay. Sorry.
So Desmond Cafferty, Mary McIntyre. One of the points that Brian Nolan made, and that I find very interesting, certainly sharing my own experience, was his point about, as I understood it, the kind of the naivety sometimes of the researchers about the kind of the institutional structures and policy processes within the organisation which they're doing the research, so that, you know, sometimes there's insufficient thought given to how the main research findings might be translated into policy change or program change, indeed, within, you know, the organisation, client organisation. And you know, I think that is very much a problem that is there. One of the ways around it, though, which is also, I think, a bit problematic, is, you know, when at some point beyond the submission of the report, there is some kind of an iterative process whereby the client will give some feedback to the researcher on the recommendations and suggest that, you know, certain recommendations are not practical or cannot be implemented in their current form and so on. And this can then lead to some kind of nuancing or re-engineering of the main recommendations. But the point I just want to make is, you know, to what extent does that risk then some kind of a watering down of the thrust of the report, or, you know, because organisations themselves very often may not be required to, at some level, you know, commission a report, but aren't really that inclined to want to make any major changes following on from it. I think that there can be a danger there, as I said, that you know, if you try to address the problem that Brian has identified, and I do believe it is there, by engaging in some kind of interaction, that it may lead to a lack of action in the end, and a lack of any real change. So that's just
okay.
I'd just give an example. In in the context of the forthcoming budget and the notion that child benefit may well be cut back, I've been arguing for quite a while that the sensible way to go with this is to tax it. I've been talking about this for longer than I care to remember, indeed. And the answer that you get back is that this is administratively impossible. Now, if you engage with the administrative system, you'll hear lots of reasons to justify, you'll hear a lot of argumentation to back up that claim. But if you stand back from it and keep that bit of distance, I think you would regard that with a lot of skepticism and say, if we really wanted to do this, we might be able to do it immediately, but we would be able to do it in time. So I think I think the point you make is very valid and is for real in the real world. That if you're in a situation where you have been contracted to do a piece of research, unless you have very tightly specified, as for example the SRI would do, that the final say in terms of what gets published, and indeed that the material has to be published, and the final say about what goes in there is retained by the researcher. If you don't have that written down at contract stage, it makes life a lot more difficult.
Just over here, you had your hand up at the front stage, and the back here. Yeah, that's what it is. Over your hand again, it's close enough, yeah.
Thanks very much for absolutely fantastic talks, I thought. Conor Galvin, University College Dublin. My original question was actually asked by my colleague across here, so it kind of makes it slightly redundant. But I'd be interested to know what the panel think in terms of the other side of the fence, the relationships we have with policymakers and how fraught and how difficult that can actually be. My own kind of circumstances in relation to education policy, and I always think of Cromean's observation about the Department of Education and Science. Under no circumstances should these people be allowed to make policy. Now that was, so we're actually working in a situation where it's perhaps less than perfect in regards to the other side of the fence very often. I'm just wondering if the panel would have any observations or thoughts about how do we make positive contributions to that situation.
It's a hard question.
I couldn't quite understand what the question was. How do we contribute to better policy making?
Yeah, in a sense, policy is a two-way thing. There are the people who do the research and there are people who, in many senses, commission the research.
Yeah.
So it's policy makers through policy research relationship. I'm just curious as to whether that is as transparent as it might actually seem in many ways. There's the general assumption coming through from all of the talks so far that it's a very straightforward sort of relationship. There's them on one side and there's us on the other. I'm not so totally convinced it's as simple and straightforward as that myself.
I think they get it now.
Yeah. Actually, thank you very much for raising that question, because that was sort of my question throughout this morning, because we kept talking about them and us. And I really don't think such a sharp boundary between whoever are these them and whoever are these us. Because I think we are as political as they are, with a small p, and they are as knowledgeable as we are, with big K. So I think it would be very wrong to think that we here and our job is to produce knowledge, and this word is used very often in the literature, and their job is to use the knowledge that we have produced, as if they have no knowledge of their own or other sources of knowledge. So I suppose that is a very wrong starting point, because I think knowledge is much wider than what sometimes researchers think as what comes out of positivist science, in my view. So this will be the wrong sort of a starting point to think about them and us. I think at least the ESRC in the UK has moved on from the word that they used to use it for many years. Knowledge transfer, they called it, which was again like that conveyor belt that I had, from the producers to the users. And they're now talking about knowledge exchange. They're talking about co-production of knowledge. They're talking about co-inquiry. So you see people that are engaged in policy and practice as partners in the production of knowledge, not just as the users. And on the other hand, the researchers are the users of knowledge as well.
I must say, I didn't see it as a relationship just between researchers and policymakers. I think there's a third group, the people for whom the policy is being made, and the people that you're studying directly a lot of the time, right? Now, I think one role that you can play is to pay more attention to what this third group are doing and seek to persuade policymakers on the basis of what you hear from them. So in fact, you're linking up the three sides of this triangle, and I don't think it's a two-hander. Now, that's not to understate the huge differences are within policymakers and within the research group and within this third group.
I think the other thing is that to think about the set of conditions that you can put in place that we can engage with policymakers in terms of not just around research or evaluation, but in, the idea of symposium, the whole range of ways that you can interact with the policy community. One of the problems as well, though, I think, is that sometimes we look on applied practice as kind of way down the line. We think of highbrow theory within academia, or we think of high-level policy. We don't pay enough emphasis to real-world practice and the real-world lives of people in the social sciences. And I think that's up to us as much as anybody else to change that. And sticking with Diane's principle of an anecdotal story, many, many years ago, I was at a research symposium in Switzerland looking at how children in care, research on children in care and people who work with them in Sweden. And the person who commissioned the research, the title of the research was, "Why Burnout in Residential Care? Why was it in Sweden so many people who worked in the childcare system were leaving?" And as a result of the symposium, I heard the person say, "I asked the wrong question." And he became more worried about the people who wouldn't leave than the people who left. And that's what he felt the research should have really focused on. So, having the questions right that we need to engage with policymakers, I think is really hugely important. And I agree with Ian that it's not, I don't see it as I think the third party is people who are the ultimate beneficiaries, who we all serve. But that can sound quite almost sanctimonious. But I think one of the ways is actually to engage in informal ways is actually a very practical way of doing it.
That's good.
I have a question which I think is maybe a difficult one, but it's kind of meta one. I think that takes us beyond some of the earlier questions, although that last one obviously takes us into
an important area about co-production of knowledge and so forth. I'm really quite taken by that response. So my question may have less impact than I had for that last question, where I felt we were looking at very technical, specific aspects. And there is a question that is running around in the back of my head as I was listening to those, is a more, I suppose, a grander level question, which might be more difficult to answer. And that is about, is there something that we need to start thinking about in terms of the specifics of Irish culture, or Irish political culture, and its openness or lack of openness to a critical, independent, social science knowledge base? We hear about varieties of capitalism which look at political economic issues, but I suspect there is somewhere also a varieties of political culture, political communication modes, and so on, that we need to think about here, or maybe it's also about political culture in the looser sense of that great word culture, again, that Liam was emphasizing. So I just wonder if this may be impressionistic. It will be hard to get, I suppose, evidence-based definitive answers to my question, but on the basis of your impression and your experiences, do you have a sense in which, of the extent to which Irish political culture, Irish policymakers in general, in your various experiences, are more or less open compared to your impressions of how that might be elsewhere?